Hi, my name is Andre Koen. I want to welcome you to this conversation about equity and equality. So, as organizations and individuals really start to think about how do they increase effective representation, how do they reach out to communities of color, and secondly, communities that have been formally excluded from processes, historically excluded. People really have a lot of questions around what is equality and what is equity and how do we approach that. And so I want to share with you a little bit that oftentimes people talk about these terms as if it is an either or, right? So it is equity versus equality, and what I like to suggest is that you can have equity and equality, right? So that they're not mutually exclusive. They are connected. They go hand in hand. There are some attributes that are very specific to each, but I think it's important to recognize that it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a both and. So what does that look like, Andre? So when we talk about this notion of equality versus equity, typically there's this diagram that people oftentimes use, right? And I would suggest that it is very difficult to take a complex mental construct and make it a two-dimensional metaphor for other things, right? So it inherently in this process of trying to take a complex mental model and put that into a two-dimensional diagram, it has its problems, right? So it's oversimplifying things, and sometimes it also may, in fact, be stereotyping things. It also is just generally an oversimplification of something that's much more complex and something we need to talk about, right? So I want to suggest that. The other thing that I want to suggest about this is really looking at the motives behind this, right? So there's equality, there's equity, and then there's liberation. And people will say, well, that is a flawed thing because people are participating, they're watching a game they didn't pay for, or so I appreciate that line of thought, but I want to take it even a step back, right? And so when we think about these models of equity and inclusion, I go to one of my favorite TV shows. Used to watch this with my grandmother. Peter Falk played this character named Columbo, and the interesting thing about Columbo was all about trying to figure out the motive. So what was the we know a crime was committed, but what was the motive? And so when we think about this notion of equity and inclusion, equity and equality, I'm really curious as to what people's motives are, right? So how you're approaching that becomes very important. What is the goal that you're trying to achieve when you address these concepts of equity and equality? What are you after, and what do you think will get you there, right? So let's take a step back. Let's go back to the former diagram, and let's recognize a couple of things. Whatever the motive is for the fence is what we have to identify or address, right? So if we have people who are standing on boxes to look over a fence, and our intent for the fence is for people not to look over it, then the people aren't at fault. We need to build a higher fence. Right. If we are looking, if our motive is to make sure that everyone has access, then we need to change some things to make sure that happens, right? And it may mean removing the fence. So what is the purpose of the fence should be the question when we start thinking about the barriers to people getting access to equity and equality. And so when I think about that, I think about Peter Falk. I think about, he's always, what is motive? What is the drive? Why are people doing what they do? Because if I understand your motives, if I understand what you're after, then your behavior makes sense. But if I don't understand the motive, then I won't. And so if your motive, if you're looking at these diagrams or these mental models is to kind of poke holes in them, then you'll find things to poke holes in. if your motive in engaging in this space is to try to understand how you think and how you interact with the world, you can certainly use those in that way. And so some folks have suggested that this is a better way to talk about equity versus equality. I would suggest that this is a fine way to talk about it. I don't know that any particular model is any better than any other model. Particularly for those folks who don't want to have the conversations, right? So there are some things about this model that people can pick apart and say, I don't know about that, right? But what I like to offer is a different model, and this really is the recognition that that these plants all need the same things. They need oxygen. They need something to grow in, a growing medium, and they need water and they need sunlight, right? So they need all of these things. Maybe not so much oxygen, but I think you get the point. So they are in need of very similar things, but they need them very differently. And so this notion of equity is about giving them what they need, even though they may in fact need all the same things, but they don't need them exactly the same way, right? And so again, I would suggest that what is your motive in talking about equity and equality? And so whatever method you use, and again, I don't care if you use this plant method, if you use the bicycle method, if you use the fence method. The real question is not what device do you use to talk about those things, but why do you want to talk about that in the first place? What is your goal? Is your goal to actually achieve equity and equality, or are you strictly just trying to make a point and not trying to be actionable, right? And so when we think about equity and equality, it does not have to be a zero-sum game. You can have both simultaneously. So here are a couple of examples, right? And so particularly when we talk about the fence, what is the purpose, right? So if my purpose is to encourage advancement in my organization, should I be looking at tenure, how long somebody's been at the organization or how long they've sat in their seat? Or should I be looking at productivity? And most folks would say that those go hand in hand. I would suggest that they're in many cases they don't, that they may not necessarily be in lockstep with one another. And so those are the kinds of things that we think about when we think about this notion of equity versus equality. Should we be creating, or how do we create those spaces where equality happens and equity is also happening? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say thank you so much for your time. This is Andre Koen. Thank you for joining our conversation on equity and equality. And we look forward to seeing who you become as we keep engaging in these conversations around equity, inclusion, and diversity. Thanks. Have a great day.